welcome. Today we have myself, Paul Koninoff, and Susan Pollock, managing editor of Journal of Dairy Science. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through some slides covering how to review a scientific paper. And I just have to couple housekeeping items before we get started. The first is there should be a poll that's available. I would just ask many of you, as you go through it, we would really like to get some of your thoughts and feedback on who you are as you join our webinar here. The second thing I'll mention is, please, as we go along, ask questions in the chat. Susan, who's with me, will be logging those, and when we're at the end, she'll start asking me those questions. Anything we don't cover will be written up and posted on our website. So when you're done, you'll receive an email indicating where you can go to listen to this webinar again, or send it off to somebody you think may be interested in it. But then the answers to all of our questions will also be listed there. So with that, let's get into our webinar right now. Okay. Before I do, just a very quick commercial. Don't forget the annual meeting's coming up June 19th to the 22nd. It's going to be a great meeting for the global community of dairy scientists. So I just remind you, if you haven't registered or made plans to go to Kansas City, please do so. If you are unable to, there also are options to join this meeting virtually. And there's a listing on the bottom right-hand side for the URL where you can go to sign up for the meeting. Okay, so what are objectives today? Really, my objectives are to help those of you that are attending the webinar to understand the publication process as it relates to peer review, both in the Journal of Dairy Science and JDS communications. I'm going to discuss briefly the process of peer review, but also discuss some just practical methods that people can use when conducting the peer review. So what exactly is scholarly peer review? Essentially, it's just an evaluation of scholarly work by people possessing expertise in that given topic. Really, the role of the reviewer is to help the editor to decide their decision on the work, whether it's acceptance, revision, or deciding the paper is unsuitable for publication. What are the products of peer review? It maintains the quality of journals published, or quality of articles published in the journal. It ensures that previous work on that given topic are discussed and acknowledged in that given work. It's also important in identifying the important findings and assessing the significance to the knowledge base that's currently out there on that topic. Many of you know, if you've been involved with reviewing for JDS or JDSC, we follow a single blind peer review process. In that process, reviewers are recruited by editors, but those reviewers are anonymous to the authors. The author and affiliation is known both to the editor and the reviewer. What I've got here diagrammed out is just a process of peer review and where it actually fits into the process. So an author will submit a paper for consideration by the journal. The senior editor will receive that paper and do an initial screen on that, and then assign it to a section editor. That section editor is then expected to go out and find peer review on that topic. And usually what they'll do is secure two people or find two people that will agree to review that paper. And then, as many of you know, there's a bit of a cycle that occurs. The reviewers will have access to the document. They then will evaluate the document, make recommendations to the editor, and then it may go back and forth between the editor, authors, and reviewers until a suitable point is found for making a final decision on that paper. So who are these peer reviewers? Really, they're just scientific experts who possess expertise on content included in the manuscript. In the case of of our journals. Those are often editorial board members, but also just general members of the scientific community. There's really no limit to who these experts are. They may have a scope that's really wide and covers the full breadth of the paper, or they may be an expert in one particular very small technique that's used in the manuscript. It's really whatever the editor feels like they need some additional expertise and some additional eyes and advice on in making that decision. There's no limit on experience as well. Quite often, they're emerging stars, but they also may be seasoned veterans, people that have been working for the journal for a long period of time. Just a quick note for the editorial board members. These are people that have been identified by journal and will sit on the editorial board. Generally, these people are expected to review 1 to 2 manuscripts each month. Ultimately, that equates to about 12 to 24 annually. And the initial appointment is for 3 years. So this is something that is really important to the journal. These people carry a tremendous load for the journal and really help us maintain the quality and do all of the things that I've already outlined is important in the review process. So what's the role of the anonymous peer reviewer? Really, it's important to understand that the reviewer, their job is not to rewrite the paper in their own preferred style, but to help the author maybe find the voice that they're looking for and find the platform that they're looking for to properly share their information. Okay, the role also is to provide the editor, as I mentioned, recommendation for publication, but to provide both an honest and fair assessment and also identify the strengths and weaknesses of the work. They may identify specific criticisms that will help the editor in evaluation and the decision process. And they may provide helpful suggestions to improve clarity of the work. This may include, and not limited to, addition to the work. So maybe more information needs to be included, slightly different analysis, or modification of the work, which can and sometimes does include not only the addition of material, but sometimes the removal of subject matter if it's not absolutely required for the publication itself. Okay, what are maybe some of the things that peer reviewers are not expected to do? It's important to understand that reviewers should not accept the review if they have a specific conflict of interest. As you can imagine, there's a whole wide array of reasons why a conflict of interest may arise, but generally speaking, a conflict of interest can be viewed as somebody having a professional or personal connection to the authors. This includes previous co-authorship, a current or fairly recent supervisory relationship between the reviewer and one of the authors, as well as whether, considering whether there's a professional or personal benefit that can result from the outcome of the decision of that manuscript. And then obviously, anybody that has a financial interest also on the outcome of that manuscript should not agree to be a peer reviewer. It's also important that the reviewer not make derogatory comments or personal comments or unfounded accusations to the authors. They should not involve anyone else in the review of the manuscript, and they should not disclose the manuscript or review details to anybody. This process is really between authors, the reviewers, and the editors. And this information should not be shared outside of those relationships. Quick thing on technical editing. What I have pictured here on the right-hand side is the technical team for editing at JDS and JDSC. These are extremely talented individuals. They're really the special forces of technical editing. And maybe one thing that I want to mention is, science is fun and reviewing papers should be fun. And really, technical editing is not expected out of the peer review process. So what I'd encourage you to do is, if you're reviewing a paper, stick to the science, stick to the fun part, and leave the technical editing to this group. The Journal of Dairy Science and Journal of JDSC have a wonderful group of people that can cover that space. So I would just encourage any of you that are reviewing papers to stick to the science and the fun stuff and leave the technical editing to these people. Okay, so why would you conduct a peer review? As you can imagine, there's a whole array of reasons why people may choose to be a reviewer. What I've done is listed a few of them. Probably what I see is among the most important is to be a part of the dairy science community. People may want to read a paper and really contribute to that community. Some people may feel it's a duty. Many of you know when you submit a paper, you are provided a reminder that in addition to submitting papers, one of the expectations of authors is that they also agree to review papers for the journal. Many people, and those would probably include the seasoned veterans that we talk about, they'll choose to accept and review a paper because they see it as their chance to mentor rising stars. There's just a tremendous talent base out there, and people are really willing to give of their time to help rising research as they develop their craft and publications for JDSC or JDS. Some people just have a curiosity. You know, they want to learn. They want to learn before and learn now rather than waiting before the paper's published. Okay, and so trying to understand what those new techniques are, or maybe some breaking results, are a good incentive to review the paper. The other thing is, as I'm sure many people are faced with situation of moving through the professional development and trying to document things that you accomplish throughout your career. And reviewing for a papers are one thing that you can document that you've accomplished and you've contributed to the community. How do you document that? I'm going to show that in a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about publons and how you can actually demonstrate and document some of your commitment to the field. What does an editor look for in a good reviewer? Really, it should be the mindset of a teacher or mentor. The expectation is that the reviewer will provide their best information that they may have or their experience to the authors. It's important that they're fair, that they're objective, that they respect timelines. We know people are busy, but probably the common thing that we hear from authors is just, hey, how soon will I get my paper back? And often the limiting step on returning papers back to authors is just the review process. So we ask that reviewers respect the timelines that we have in front of us. It's also important that a reviewer be constructive and they provide feedback to make the submission better. And I will say, I'm always, as an editor, it really does make me feel good when I see positive information to make work better. And then authors comment and say, thank you for this information. We appreciate that. We do believe that it works. It makes the paper better. And when you see that, you know that that's the scientific process really at work, designed the way it's supposed to be. I will also mention when the journals do look for recruiting new section editors, really people's track record as a reviewer is something that, number one, gets us on the radar screen and gives us an understanding of, you know, how you are for a reviewer in handling those papers, which is really important as people seek those positions and serve the journal as section editors. If you're interested in reviewing papers, I will say sometimes I hear people say, well, how do I review more papers? I would just encourage you, to send an email out to maybe an editor that's within your section of interest and say, hey, I'd be interested in reviewing papers. That's a very effective way. I'll show you another formal way to do that. But I would encourage you, any of you that are interested in doing it, you haven't done it, just reach out to some of the names on the website and we'll do our best to get you involved in this process. Okay, so how do you formally do that? Really, the journal uses Scholar One as a way to manage manuscripts. So if you have a Scholar One account, and I'd encourage you to look at that account and see what information is there. Okay, check your keywords, make sure email is correct and contact information is correct. But if you have a Scholar One account, and you do if you've been a previous author or reviewer, this is probably the most formal way of getting on the radar screen to review papers, okay? Okay, getting started. Really what we expect reviewers to do is, once they receive that manuscript invitation and they agree to it, what they'll do is they'll have access to the manuscript itself. And the recommendation is you take your thoughts and your ideas as a reviewer to a separate document, whether that's a pen and paper, whether that's a PDF document or a Word document. Quite often people will just start typing their review in a Word document, okay? And I'll show you later where that information can be transferred. But initially what reviewers should be doing is thinking, number one, is that subject appropriate for the Journal of Dairy Science? Does it fit with the scope? The scope of our journal is listed on the website. And so if you want to know where that is, I just encourage you to go and read. There's some great descriptions about what fits in the Journal of Dairy Science, okay? Another thing that the reviewer should be considering is the research question important, and does it contribute to the knowledge base on the topic? So many things in there, but there's just generally thinking, okay, is this research appropriate? Okay, I'm gonna go through maybe just the components of the paper and think about it, but generally look at the title as a reviewer. Is that title appropriate? Is it descriptive? Does it tell us something about what those authors are doing? The abstract should also follow a very clear format. There should be a short background, one, maybe two sentences maximum on why the paper should be done. What is the purpose of that paper? Short description of the methods used, identification of the key results, identification of the major conclusions, and then does it match with the paper? I know we all write papers, and you write these, you don't ever sit down and write a paper from start to finish. You write it in chunks of time. And sometimes authors may overlook some major conclusion. You may write an abstract, go back to the paper, and miss a major observation of the paper. So just make the reviewers, the expectation is that they have a review of that abstract and make sure it actually does indeed match the paper. Okay, the introduction, I know me personally, I always enjoy reading the introduction because it's a great snapshot on what's known and where this paper is going in terms of scientific discovery. Okay, and really as a reviewer, you should be assessing how that's described and identifying whether the question of research is really zeroed in on. Can the reader read that introduction and know exactly where that author or those authors are going with that research? Identifying gaps in knowledge or maybe problems that the research addresses should be included in the introduction, as well as an identification of the objective and the hypothesis. Okay, materials and methods. We don't have near enough time to talk about all of the things that should be in materials and methods, but I think it's probably a good way to describe this is the reviewer should ask themselves, is what is listed here, does that provide the reader enough detail to replicate that study? Now, maybe every single reagent isn't listed in there, but generally speaking, somebody should be able to read these materials and methods and actually repeat that study. They should ask themselves and assess whether those methods are appropriate simply to meet the objectives or answer that research problem. So comparing what's described in the materials and methods back to what is described introduction section of that paper. Results and discussion, sometimes they can be put together or broken apart. If they're broken apart, results should be, reviewers should evaluate the credibility of data collection. So reviewers often have great expertise in the same results, maybe using the same techniques as the authors, and they're usually the people that identify whether the data are credible and of publishable quality. Reviewers should also ensure that there's consistency within the tables and figures and not overlap, okay? I always encourage reviewers to look at the figure and table captions and, really evaluate whether those are informative. Does it describe what's being illustrated in that figure or that table? As far as the discussion, really what should be outlined and reviewers should consider is if the authors are properly conveying the meaning or the significance of the results, and challenge the authors, if they may be over promising on the significance, or sometimes under promising some of the significance, or under describing some of that significance. The discussion should be very clear, and there should be focus. One thing that's sometimes missed is when people are reading papers, they may forget, or perhaps even unwilling to identify perhaps some of the limitations in this study. And so helping the authors understand, okay, what you've written is great, but there are some limitations to the study design. It may not be a fatal flaw, just something to add to that discussion. Often, again, when reviewers are familiar with the techniques or the studies, they may help authors identify different anomalies that may occur. Okay. The other thing is, usually the authors are very well aware of past research in this area, but reviewers are just great people for identifying maybe past research that was done and maybe provide suggestions on discussion. I will say that reviewers should not suggest that people cite their research. The idea is to be speaking on the field of science. So don't use this as an opportunity to encourage people to cite your research. You should be encouraging them to identify any research that's out there that may be applicable to what they're trying to say or what they're trying to describe. I've already mentioned, I guess, just maybe some of the practical limitations or applications of the research, but taking a big step back and thinking about, okay, what are some really important implications, whether it's theoretical or practical implications, to the field of dairy science and maybe the sector of dairy production. And Journal of Dairy Science is a really special journal to be straddling both those areas. And it's really important that editors also take time, or reviewers take some time to remark on that and consider that in the paper itself. Once the reviewer is done, to take a step back and just ask yourself, is that paper clearly written? Are there some rough edges that could be smoothed out? Again, it need not be technical, but just big picture. Is it clearly written? And perhaps challenge or point out to the authors that maybe some areas could be smoothed out. Is the content logical? And then, as I've mentioned, as reviewers, and I'm also to blame when I work with graduate students and read dissertations and make suggestions of additions. And sometimes we don't spend equal or equally valuable time thinking, well, maybe are there some things that don't need to be included into the manuscript? There's different reasons for that, depending on the paper, and there's no better person to determine that than the reviewer of that paper. Okay, so again, what are some general attributes to be an effective peer reviewer? Many of these things I've talked about, but it's important that they be professional, that they be positive, and pleasant in their comments. It's also important that you read the information that you get from the editor. There's a lot of detail packed in there, including deadlines or expectations for timelines. So make sure you read the invitation. And we try to keep them consistent. But I will say from time to time, emails that come from editors or the journal, they're changed or added to. So it's important that you read those invitations. Reviewers should be helpful and they should be challenging. The suggestion is to comment and focus on the science. I've already mentioned to be timely. Be realistic. As a reviewer, you don't want to ask somebody to, do things that are really almost impossible to do. So be realistic. The goal is, again, to have that teacher-mentor mindset. And so when you're doing that and you're working with a student or a mentee, you want your comments to be realistic and empathetic. We're all human. We get these reviews back, and they can, they are important. They can be extremely valuable. But let's face it, sometimes there's some sensitive feelings and careers that are involved. So it's important that reviewers really have an empathetic view on how they're bringing information to the authors. Reviewers should also be open. They may be firm believers on some particular experimental design or some technique, but they should be open to other situations and other ways of doing things. And the review should come back in an organized process. Just like anything we do in science, there's maybe specific ways people are most comfortable doing things personally, but they should be organized so people can go through and really make effective measures to make the paper better by seeing these organized thoughts that you've provided. Just a couple things. I mentioned Publons. This is a way. So this is what a review looks like in the Journal of Dairy Science. There's a website that identifies what Publons is and whether you are willing to let your information be counted by Publons. But Publons, it has a number of different purposes. One way is one function of Publons, and you just have to Google Publons. If you don't have an account yet, I'd encourage you to do so. It helps you verify peer review activity that you may do for journals, as well as editing history. Okay, this is just an example of one of our authors in the Journal of Dairy Science, but you can see this author has 285 verified reviews. So if you need to document your review history, Publons is a great trusted source to do that. Okay, the next thing you'll see is this general report card. There's an evaluation of the graphical abstract, and then a number of important points that we've already talked about. Is the paper original? Is it clear? Is it got complete data? Is the interpretation sound? And is it important to the field? Those can all be ranked, and they're used by the editor to make the final decision. The next thing is reviewers are asked if they're willing to review a revision of that manuscript, and then ultimately the recommendation that the reviewer has. And these are the options that the reviewers can use: accept for publication, accept after authors have considered suggestions. The third is revision needed before a decision can be made, or reject for publication. There is a field. Reviewers can actually add confidential comments to the editor, and that's illustrated here. The next is, this is where, as I mentioned, you can work at your comments on Word or some other file type. But most of those comments, what people do is they'll cut those comments and then paste them into this section here. Generally, the way people organize things is major comments are listed first, and then minor comments are listed after. What are minor comments? These are primarily editorial comments that authors are not expected to reply to line by line. Additionally, some people actually will choose to upload the files that they've actually used in in conducting that review. And so you don't necessarily have to cut and paste. You can just upload them and drop them here. Okay, so we're really towards the end of our webinar here today. One of the things I'll recommend is if you're interested in even a deeper dive on this topic, Elsevier just has a wonderful peer reviewer course. I'd encourage you, even if you're just remotely interested in this as a reviewer or perhaps even an author, I would encourage you to go to this URL, enroll in this course, and you actually are provided a certificate if you complete them. And some of the information that I shared today is actually found this course after I personally went through this. But it's just a wonderful course that goes into maybe greater detail than what I was able to go into today. So that's really the end of my webinar. As I tweeted out this morning, I would do my best to make sure that this is impactful and short as well. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Being a peer reviewer is really important to the journal. It's one way to contribute to the community that's associated with ADSA and Journal of Dairy Science, or JDSC. What I have outlined here or illustrated here are just some of the many people that are involved in the editorial process, section senior editors and our technical editing team. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And what I'll maybe do is just open it up to questions. And Susan, I know you've been tracking some of these questions. Have you been able to maybe identify a few, one or two, just to get us started with questions?
Yeah, so the first question is, what are the risk factors for rejection, and what is the rejection rate? So what is it that causes the journal to reject a paper?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Why would a paper be rejected? I would say probably the reason why it would be rejected as far as black and white is if reviewers or editors were able to identify a fatal flaw, maybe related to an experimental design or maybe a technique that wasn't properly conducted. There's many reasons why a paper can be rejected, but I think quite often it's usually related to how the study was conducted. And so something described probably in the materials and methods. So many other reasons, but that's probably the one most common. As far as our acceptance and rejection rate, I know that can be calculated on some of the reports that we put out. Just off the top of my head, I think it's right around 55 to 60% acceptance is I think what we're running at most recently.
Okay, are you ready for another question?
Sure, yes.
Okay. We have someone asking, how can reviewers get feedback on how effective their reviews are, and how would they get that information from the journal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, admittedly, we probably don't do a great job of that, right? Susan is actually letting reviewers know how effective they're doing. I think one of the things I would encourage you to do, again, you're just being part of this community, and we're all human, and I think it's important to get feedback and dialogue on how we're working with the journal and what we're contributing. I would encourage you, if you do submit some materials to an editor, and you may just want to follow up, maybe not the day of your return for review, but a little later, say, hey, what do you think of my reviews? Are they helpful? Are there things that I can do differently or better? And so I would say that feedback right now, Susan, is probably informal, and it's at the human level with the section and senior editors. So I would just encourage anybody that's interested to reach out to the editors that you're working with.
Okay, do you have time for maybe one more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so why does the reviewer decide whether the research is appropriate to the journal? Wouldn't the editor reject the paper before sending it to reviewers?
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of evaluating scope, I think that question is really okay. In evaluating scope, who's responsible for that? I will say it's probably one of those situations where, a variety of opinions are important and evaluated, but the person asking the question is absolutely right. This is one of the things that is the responsibility of the senior editor and the section editor to evaluate that. And so sometimes they may see a paper that just clearly doesn't fit, and then the decision is made not to go forward with that paper. But other times, like anything in science, sometimes there's some gray areas and second opinions are needed on that. And so that's really why a reviewer may be asked whether this paper fits in the scope. It's hard for me to come up with an exact reason, but really sometimes there's gray areas and the opinion is valued in just making that decision.
Okay, actually, I'm going to throw one more at you.
Sure, let's keep going.
Okay. Should the reviewer make comments about mistakes in the writing, or does the review focus exclusively on the science?
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned, the expectation is not for the reviewer to do a complete technical review and technical edit of the manuscript. But if a message, if the paper is good and really is the editor or the reviewer thinks that paper should be published, but they want to challenge the authors on maybe just improving the clarity of the work, it would not be inappropriate to say, this work is good, but I would encourage you to improve the flow of the study. So I would say it would be appropriate to comment on the technical makeup of the paper and the flow of the paper, but reviewers really don't need to go through the all of the individual technical edits. And that's a hard thing to do simultaneously. Evaluate the science, evaluate the flow, and do the technical editing. So I guess the answer is it's fine if you can handle it, but I would just recommend sticking to the science and the flow, less on the technical composure of it. Good question.
So I think we've got a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A that we can follow up with after the webinar.
Sure.
If that's all right?
Yes. Yep. I'll certainly go through them and answer everything that I can quickly, and we'll post them on the website. Good. Okay, I just want to once again thank everybody for joining us, and look forward to meeting you again in this type of webinar format. Thank you very much for your time.